It's Paul's last letter, and we're looking at the last chapter in the last letter of Paul's life. And if you know anything about the epistles, if you've ever read any of Paul's other writings, Galatians, Ephesians, any of the other writings, you know that Paul can be stern. How's that? We'll use that word. Paul is not afraid to lay down the law. Paul will, he will point out error. He will point out flaws. He will point out doctrines that need correcting. He will point out actions that need correcting. And he is... Paul can be a very stern taskmaster. And in 2 Timothy, though, and especially again the further you read in the letter, and when you get to the last chapter, especially if you were to read it in a modern translation, you'll notice a distinct change in Paul's manner, in his tone, in his attitude. Paul knows that his days are numbered. He knows that his life is coming to an end very quickly. And in fact, most scholars believe that by the time young Timothy received this letter, that Paul had actually been executed. That before Timothy was ever able to receive the letter, that Paul had his life had been taken for preaching the gospel. And so in this, especially in this last chapter, we really see the man. We see Paul kind of pouring out his heart, and Paul being very human to Timothy. Timothy was like his son in the ministry, and so in this last chapter, he just kind of pours out his heart. I believe that probably there were more tears written at the end in Paul's eyes at the end of 2 Timothy than perhaps all his other letters combined, because he is again, he knows that his life is coming to an end, that his days are numbered, and so he is giving his parting instructions to young Timothy. And in doing that, in verse 9, he asked Timothy, he says, if you will, come quickly. He asked Timothy to bring him a jacket. He says, I need you to come to me. Come just as soon as you can. Then in verse 10, he says something very interesting. He mentions a man by the name of Demas. Now, Demas is only mentioned 3 times in the entire New Testament. We don't know a lot about Demas, but in 3 little mentions we can get a really good picture of the rise and fall of Demas. In chapter 10, or in verse 10 of chapter 4, Paul says that Demas has forsaken me. He has loved this present world. And then he mentions that there are 2 others that are with him that he says they have left, but they're gone to do ministry. But he says Demas has forsaken me. So this morning I want us to look at Demas and just kind of take what we can from 3 mentions of Demas in the Word of God, and then we'll come back to this final mention here in 2 Timothy and make some conclusions about this man named Demas who deserts Paul. And ultimately the topic this morning, we use the word pretty often in the church, the word backsliding. And I said a while back that I think we really need to work on, instead of using the word Christian, because everybody's a Christian. All you got to do is go out and ask people, are you a Christian? Yeah. It doesn't matter. You go to beer joint. Y'all Christians? Yeah. It doesn't matter where you go. Everywhere you go, everybody's a Christian. Ask them to define Christian. You get a million answers. I think a more appropriate term for us would be followers of Christ. That's a big difference in saying I'm a Christian and saying I am following Christ. By the same token, I think that perhaps this word backslider may be a little bit misleading. When I think about backsliding, some of you, you remember back to being a child, being young, and going out in the yard and playing. Maybe not even when you're young. May have happened to you recently. But you start trying to climb up a hill, and maybe the grass is wet or the dirt is loose, and you really want to get to the top of the hill. You have every intention intention of getting to the top of the hill. But again, the grass is wet or the dirt is loose and you slip. Maybe you fall or slide back down the hill. No fault of your own. You didn't do anything wrong. And in fact, the sooner you start right back up, you're trying to get to the top of the hill. Now, that's kind of what I think of in backsliding. But what I think Paul is describing here isn't so much backsliding. And what I see in the church today is really not so much backsliding, but I think a better term would be desertion. If you were in the military, you'd be AWOL. Absent without leave. You have deserted the call. You have made a decision. You have made a choice to go in a different direction. And that's what Demas does here in this. And more people today than ever are doing that in the church. And the church across America today is, the roles are absolutely inflated. The difference in the role and the attendance in the church in America is mind-boggling. And, every one of us, I wouldn't even know how far to list and how long to go on of naming those who once upon a time were not even just in the church, but involved in the church. They had roles in the church. They were working in the church. They had positions in the church. They were serving God. And today, you couldn't find them. Sherlock Holmes couldn't find them. They have abandoned. They have deserted the faith. They have turned their back. And Andrew Murray said one time, there are only two kinds of Christians in the world. He said those that burn out for God and those that burn out on God. I think that's a pretty good description. Are we burning out for God or are we burning out on God? And when we look at Demas, here's my challenge for you today, because it'd be real easy to do. And in fact, to some extent, I've already done it myself this morning in talking about those that have, whether you want to use the word backslidden, abandoned, deserted, whatever. It's real easy. Oh yeah, I know some of them. I can name you 4 or 5. Yeah, I know those folks. Yeah, let's get them. Tell them about it, Jimmy. No. Here's the way I want us to approach Demas in this topic this morning. Is certainly if we know those who are in that category, backslidden, deserters, whatever you want, whatever words you feel comfortable with, we ought to be praying for those folks. I genuinely believe with all my heart that many of those that we label as backsliders, desert, whatever we want to call them, would really like to come back to church. They just don't know how. They just don't know how. They would really like to come back, but they're afraid that when they walk in the front door, somebody's going to go, oh, my, the roof's going to fall in. And they're going to want to duck under the carpet. They just don't know, that somebody, when they walk back in the door, is going to say, well, where have you been? And they're going to be obligated almost, instead of loving and, what if all of a sudden we learn to be as loving and compassionate and caring and friendly to those who return to the church as we are to those who attend for the first time, when we first meet them. I really think that many of them would really love to come back. They just exactly don't know how. They're embarrassed. Maybe they left over something they realize now that it was childish and petty, and they know that, and they're embarrassed. We need to really put an effort into our way of dealing with people, into our prayer. God, make us a forgiving, welcoming people, that when those people do return, when we do see them in the street, when we do see them in the store, we don't chastise them, we don't beat them up, we let them know we love them, and we let them know we miss them. There's a big difference in that and saying, well, good grief, I thought you had died, those kind of things. And like I said, it's important that we learn that and pray that God would make us that kind of people. We need to pray for those who are in that condition, that God would help them and grant them the strength, the courage, whatever they need to be able to return to their church, to any church, to a church, a God-fearing, God-believing, God-preaching, Bible-believing church. If they'd go somewhere and get involved in the kingdom of God, because I don't care which church they go to, what we need today are people serving God in a church somewhere. Because we need, we're slowly but surely getting outnumbered in this world, and we need to pray for them. And then finally, my other point this morning of looking at this text is saying, dear God, you know what? I know that I am but about that much from being in that condition myself. I'll tell you what. I'll tell you the honest truth. You know what I told Caleb this morning? We were getting dressed, and he came walking through, and I said, you know what I hate about church? Dress clothes. I'm about one tie from being backslidden myself. I'm just going to be honest with you. I'm about one shirt that's too tight in the neck from saying I quit. Let's be honest. Quit showing off because you don't have on a tie, Jason. I said, listen, all of us are about one insult. We're all about one, we're just one step from being in that boat ourselves. And I see that in this man named Demas, because the first thing I want to point out to you is Demas' devotion. I want us to learn a little bit, as much we can, about this man. Demas is a man, again, mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. He is mentioned in the book of Colossians. He is mentioned here in 2 Timothy, and then he's mentioned in a few pages in the book of Philemon. Now, I want you to know, and some of you probably, I'm sure, already aware of this, but the books of the Bible are not arranged in chronological order. They are not there based on when the events happened or when they were written necessarily. For example, most people believe that Job is actually the oldest written book in the Bible. Now, obviously, the events of Genesis occurred before the events in Job. You with me? Man had to be created before the events of Job could take place. But most people believe that the book of Job was actually the first book that was written down when pen was put to paper. Now, you know that it's obviously not the first book in the Bible. Same thing is true in the New Testament. They're not there in order. They're grouped more by the type of book they are. We've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Gospels. We've got Paul's epistles. Then we've got here Titus and Timothy, what are known as pastoral epistles. They kind of deal with the church and the leadership of the church. And so, that being said, let me tell you about these 3 instances where Demas is mentioned. Our first mention is in the book of Colossians. In the book of Colossians, chapter 4, verse 14, we have a really simple statement. Paul just simply says that Luke and Demas are with me. That's it. Now, the book of Colossians was written somewhere around the year 60 A.D. And so somewhere around 60, the year 60, Paul says, I know a man named Demas. That's pretty much what we know about that instance. Paul says, yeah, I know Demas. That's about the extent of what Paul says in the year 60. In the book of Philemon, now Philemon actually in the Bible comes after 2 Timothy. But Philemon was actually written around 63 A.D. And so it was written about 3 years after Paul said in Colossians, I know Demas. And in Philemon verse 24, no chapters in Philemon, just basically one page. In Philemon verse 24, Paul says this. He says, Marcus, Aristarchus, Demas, Lucas, my fellow laborers. So in the year 60, in Colossians, Paul says, I know Demas. In the year 63 in Philemon, he says, Demas is my fellow laborer. 2 Timothy was written around the year 67 A.D. And so we have a 7-year span, 3 mentions of Demas. In 60, Paul says, I know Demas. In 63, he says, Demas is my fellow laborer. In 67, the year 67 in 2 Timothy, Paul says, Demas has forsaken me. So in a 7-year span, this is what we know about Demas and Paul's relationship. In the year 60, he says, I know him. In the year 63, he says, he is my fellow laborer. In the year 67, he says, Demas has deserted me. I want to talk for just a moment to begin with about this mention in Philemon. What Paul says in the year 63 A.D. when he says, Demas is my fellow laborer. Now, fellow laborer is another one of those words that you and I just don't use. We just don't, there is nobody in here who has in their lifetime. I am not a gambling man. I consider this to be a sure thing. There is no one in this building who has ever walked up to anybody and said, I would like to introduce you to Joe. He and I are fellow laborers. No. We are fellow laborers down at the mill. We just don't use that word. Well, it's just not a word that we use. It just doesn't happen. We just, a while ago when Jason was talking about somebody else driving a bus, he didn't say, hey, they're fellow laborers at the bus garage with me. We just don't use that word. It's just not one we use. But it is an awesome word. I'll be honest with you. If Paul was to ever call me a fellow laborer, I would be on cloud nine. There is nothing better you could put on your Christian resume than to say that I am a fellow laborer with Paul. I was a fellow laborer with Paul. It is an awesome word. Two things about that word. So first of all, is that part of it that says fellow. We're fellow laborers. Paul is saying from Colossians in the year 60 to saying, yeah, I know Demas, to the year 63 in Philemon saying, we are fellow laborers. Paul is saying, I love Demas. That's what he's saying when he says we are fellow laborers. Demas and I are like this. That word that he uses there is a word that describes their labor, that they are irreplaceable to each other. Paul is saying that Demas and I together are doing things that neither one of us could do by ourselves. I want you to understand, when in the year 67 in 2 Timothy, when Paul says, Demas has forsaken me, Paul is not saying just anybody walked away. Paul is saying a good man. Listen, I've been in the church all my life. I want to tell you what happens when somebody, and probably every one of us here have done it, when somebody drops out of church, when somebody quits going to church, when somebody resigns their position or whatever. What's the first thing that some good, God-fearing, well-meaning Christian will utter? Well, they never loved Jesus anyway. I want you to know that's not the case with Demas. Demas loved God. He was a fellow laborer. He worked for God. You know what the word laborer means, don't you? I know some of you don't like the word, but you know what it means. Paul says, Demas is a fellow laborer, just simply based on timing. In all likelihood, Demas went on at least the first missionary journey with Paul. In other words, Demas had been out starting churches. Demas had been out leading people to Christ. Demas had probably been along on some of those trips when Paul got ran out of town, when Paul got arrested, when Paul got stoned. Demas is not just somebody that's tagging along. Demas is a fellow laborer. He's involved in the work. Listen, what I want you to understand about Demas is, as I said a while ago, it can be anyone. All of us. We need to pray for those who are out of church, those who have walked away from church and the faith and serving God. But we also need to pray for ourselves and understand that by the grace of God, there go I. It could be me as well. Listen, there's not a person in here who doesn't know someone who used to be actively involved in the work of God, who was actively involved in the church, who had positions, who served God, who was leading people to Christ, and all of a sudden one day just boom, seemed like they were gone. And you said, I never thought it would be them. I could stand here and name names, prominent names, that all of us know, of people who just seemingly one day turned their back on the faith. Demas was not just some nobody. Demas was a fellow laborer with Paul. Demas was intricately involved in the ministry of Paul. When the churches were planted, when the missionary journeys were taken, Demas was there. And in a span of the year 63 to the year 67, in 4 years, we read of a man who is labeled as a fellow laborer. In 4 years. Paul says, my fellow laborer has forsaken me. Not just anybody. Listen, we need to beware. We need to be cautious that Satan is seeking whom he may devour. It could be any one of us. In fact, I would submit to you that the more you love God, the more you try to do for God, the more you serve God, the bigger target you are to Satan. Demas was a fellow laborer. Now, not only do we see Demas, his devotion, but I want you to see his decline. Now, I got to be honest with you. I can't point you to a verse. I can't point you to a chapter. There's only 3 times his name is even mentioned. The Bible goes from in the year 63 in Philemon saying that Demas is a fellow laborer to the year 67 in 2 Timothy saying Demas has forsaken me. Now I said a while ago that every one of us knows someone who was at one time involved in the church, seemingly loved God, was working for God, involved in the church, doing ministry, doing things, and it seemed like just boom, overnight they were gone. Can I submit to you in my honest opinion, I don't think anybody just goes boom, they're gone. I don't believe that anyone gets up on October the 19th and goes, I just think I'll turn my back on God. I don't think so. I don't believe it. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. I just don't think, generally speaking, that's what happens. I think what happens is over time, from the year 63 to the year 67. Maybe 4 years for Demas, maybe 14 for somebody else, maybe 4 weeks for somebody else. But over a period of time, their prayer life kind of starts to decline. And over a period of time, they stop studying the Word of God like they did. And over a period of time, they stop attending church like they did. And over a period of time, they quit fellowshipping with other believers like they did and start hanging around with other folks. And over a period of time, they just slowly drift away. I heard about the young man, he got in some trouble. And the judge ruled that what he had to do was they were building a new road in town. And that they were going to make him paint the stripe. Going to let him paint the road. And so the first day they got him some paint and a roller, sent him out to paint the road. First day, the young man, he gets 2 miles of stripe painted. Second day, they take him back out there. He only gets about 1.5 miles painted. Sheriff thinks that's odd, but well, maybe just, I don't know. Third day he goes out there, he only gets about 3/4 of a mile painted. Fourth day he goes out there and he barely gets 1/4 of a mile painted. And the sheriff looks at him and says, well, what in the world's going on? Said, every day you paint less. And the first day, man, you knocked out 2 miles. Today you only get 1/4 of a mile. And the young man looked at him and says, yeah, but the bucket keeps getting further away. I keep having to walk further back to the bucket. Somebody lean over and explain that to your neighbor. Listen, that's exactly what's happened to a lot of people's faith. We just keep getting further and further and further from the bucket. Further from the bucket. I don't believe for one moment that all of a sudden Demas got up one day and said, you know what, I'm just sick of that, Paul. I'm not doing it anymore. I quit. I believe from the year 63 when he was a fellow laborer to the year 67 when he left God, when he forsook Paul. I believe over time he'd been laughed at, he'd been ridiculed, he'd been made fun of, he'd been run out of town just like Paul. And over time, little by little, it chipped away and chipped away and chipped away till finally one day he just quit going. He quit coming. You see his decline. You see he was devoted. You see his decline. But that being said, let me say this. I also believe it's a decision.